Hello guys, and welcome back to my video. So in this video we are going to be learning about Riverpod. This is a Riverpod masterclass and this is for absolute beginners. So Riverpod is a state management package. It's not only a state management package, it can also do other things like caching, but in this instance we are going to be learning about state management, right? So Riverpod is built using providers. So everything you do in Riverpod is going to revolve around providers. So we'll find that a provider is just an object that encapsulates a piece of state and allows us to listen to that state in case if there are changes, right? So the first provider that we are going to look at is the basic provider. But before we do that, let's first set up Riverpod. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to have the latest version of Flutter Riverpod. After that, you go into the pub/spec.yaml file in your project, go into the dependencies, and make sure that you paste it below. You make sure that you paste it in your dependencies, and you make sure that Flutter pub get is working. Right, so make sure that you say Flutter pub get, and let's go wait for it to run. So just wait a little for Flutter pub get to finish getting the Riverpod package, right? Okay, so now that is done, we need to wrap this my app with what we call the provider scope. So what happens in Flutter is that if we have, like, let's say a piece of state that we want into another widget, so what happens is we can pass that state from the parent widget to the children widget to the other children's widget to the other children widget down the widget tree, right? But let's say if we have 1000 widgets, how are we going to do that? It's going to slow down our application passing the state from the parent widget to the last widget if we have thousands of widgets. So what we'll do is we'll wrap this my app, which is a parent widget, with the provider scope. What the provider scope does is that it allows us to listen to any piece of state anywhere in our widget without even passing it from the parent widget to the child widget. It allows us to access that piece of state directly into the widget that we need that piece of state. So what we are going to do is let's just wrap this with a widget, and then the widget that we are going to use is going to be called provider scope. So what this provider scope is more of, like, it's a global variable for providers. It allows us to access any provider anyway in our widget, right? So let's just put the constant. Okay, let's remove this constant here. Okay, so now let's go into, I've created this home page. So what this home page is as a couple of buttons. We have the provider for the provider, basic provider, the state provider, the stream provider, the future provider, the change notifier provider, state notifier provider, right? Like that. So now what we are going to do is let's go into this button will lead us to the provider widget, right? So let's go into the provider widget, and then let's create a basic provider, right? So to create a basic provider, the first thing is to declare final, and then let's say we say my provider. is equal to provider. Let's import Flutter-Riverpod. Okay, this is a mistake. Yeah. So what we need to do is we need to create a provider. I'm going to create to create a provider. We first need to use the final keyword and then say provider is equals to provider. In this case, we need a provider of type string. And then this provider is going to just return my name. It's going to just return my name. And then let's import Flutter-Riverpod, right? So let's import Flutter-Riverpod. So this basic provider is often used to access like service classes or repository classes. We'll talk about that in the more later in the video. But in this case, I just wanted to show you this basic provider. So how are we going to access this basic provider inside our widgets? What we need to do is we change this stateless widget into what we call the consumer widget. So what this consumer widget does, it allows us to consume providers into our widgets, right? And then inside the build method, what we need to do is we need to pass in a parameter called widget reference. So this widget reference, it allows us to watch providers or to get a reference of where a provider is located. For example, I'm going to say final my name is equals to ref.watch. Ref.watch, and then provider is going to watch this provider. So let's remove this. So what it's going to do, it's going to watch this provider, right? So if there are any changes to this state, this watch method will allow us to update those changes, right? So let's just say body center, and then let's say text. So inside this text, what we are just going to do is so what we can do is body my name dot. What we can just do, we can just center text, and then we're just going to give it my name dot toString. We're just converting that to a string. So we forgot the child, which is a text. Okay. Now like this, it's now okay. So let's just give it an up bar. Okay. So let's just reload our application. Now as you can see, if I go to the provider, I think we have an error. let's restart the debugging process. So if I click on the provider, as you can see, now my name is now displayed, shown as Temple. So this is the basic provider. So the next provider that we are going to take a look at is the state provider. So now the second provider that we are going to be looking at is the state provider. So unlike the basic provider, the state provider is a provider that gives us a way to modify its state. So as you can see from the documentation, it says that the state provider exists primarily to allow the modification of simple variables by the user interface. Okay, so they've given us example. For example, let's just do an example on how we can modify the state using an user interface. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a provider called state provider, which is going to be state provider and of type integer, and then we need this integer is going to start from 0. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to import the Flutter-Riverpod package. Okay, so now in our let's create the user interface. So we need to create a floating action button. Floating action button. On pressed, let's just give it an empty function. And then let's give it an icon. And then let's say icons dot add. And then let's a body. And then let's give it a center. Child. The child is going to be text. And then let's leave it like this for the moment. Let's leave it empty like this. And then what we are going to do is let's change this stateless widget like we did in the previous example. We are going to use a consumer widget, which allows us to consume Riverpod providers. And then we have the widget reference that is going to allow us to access a provider, right? So we are just going to say final counter is equals to we are just going to say final counter is equals to reference dot watch. So we want to watch if there are any changes to the state provider. State provider. Okay, like this. So into our floating action button on the onPressed method, what we are going to do is we are just going to say reference dot read. So we have two methods in Riverpod. We have the watch method. So this watch method is usually used in user interfaces, as it allows us to monitor the state in a provider. So if that state changes, it will automatically update the user interface. That's why we use watch. But if you are reading providers from, let's say, patterns, like say elevated patterns, floating action patterns, we use the read method. And then we say state provider dot notifier, and then dot state plus plus. So this notifier will, this not dot notifier will just check, will just be will allow the floating action pattern, will just allow the notification, the floating action pattern to be notified if there is any state change. And then in that state, we want to increment in that state. As you can see in our initial, in our initial state provider, we have in our initial state provider, it starts from 0. Our integer starts from 0. So in this case, if we use this state plus plus, we'll be incrementing this state from 0, allowing it to change, let's say 1, 2, and going on, right? And then in our center widget, where we want to display the changes in the state, we'll just say counter dot toString, something like this. And then style text, style color, I was saying colors dot black, and then the font size, font size is equals to 25, right? So now that we are, we have an error, I don't know why. Okay, now that we are done, let's reload our application and let's see. So let's go into state provider. Then let's try to increment the state. As you can see, our state is increasing, right? So let's just go into our scaffold and let's just put an up bar. Okay, something like this. Okay, it's supposed to be capital letter B. Let's reload the application. Okay, so if we go back and then if we come back, as you can see, our state is still 26. But if we go onto our initial provider and then we use what we call auto dispose, right? Let's reload our application. let's just restart debugging. No. Okay, let's go state provider. And then let's increment the counter. Okay, so now if we go back to the main page and we come back, you can see our counter is restarted. So what this auto dispose does is that it allows us to dispose any piece of state that we are no longer listening to it. So let's say, for example, in this case, if I increase this counter, let's say like this, and then if I go back to the main page, we are no longer listening to that state provider. Hence, if I go back, you see that it has restarted the state. So if we remove this auto dispose like this, and then let's restart the debugging session. And then if I go to the state provider, and then if I increment the counter, and then I go back to the main page, we return to the state provider, you see that our state remains 10 as it's not disposed because we did not use the auto dispose method, right? So that's it about the state provider. In the next video, we're going to be looking about two providers. We're going to look at two providers that are used to fetch data. We're going to look at the future provider and the stream provider.